Hi there, this is Mr. Mitchell with another video, and hey, we get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the tide. I mean, can you believe it? We've had you mean, what'd you say? It's not about the crimson tide? Oh, well, how about my favorite detergent, Tide? You mean it's not about that kind of tide either? Oh well, I knew it all along. It'd be about this kind of tide. The water level along the coastline varies with the time of day. And this, of course, is called the tide. Sometimes it's high tide, sometimes it's low tide. And it wasn't until the 1600s before mankind figured out the cause of the tides. It's the moon's gravitational pull. Earth's waters bulge on the side facing the moon. And you can see the diagram here. When the moon's here, you have the waters which are leaning toward the moon. And what that does, it makes the waters on the Earth more of an oval shape. So whenever you have the moon directly across from the waters, that's when it's high tide, and on the other side of the Earth it is high tide at that moment also. See, the largest high tide is over here. You have low tide anywhere right out in here where it's not facing or directly away, and then you have small high tide, which is still a high tide. When the particular side doesn't face the moon or is opposite, it's in a dip or a low tide. My bad, it's not opposite, but not facing the moon, it's low tide. Generally, you have 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a day. Now, these times are predictable, and you have what's called a tidal range. A tidal range is the height between the high tide and the low tide that you will have in a day. Now, if you have a really steep ocean floor, I'll go with this color. I like that color. Steeper than this, then you would have a bigger tidal range. But if it's not steep, then you would have not so big a tidal range. The sun's gravitational pull isn't as much. You know, the sun is much, much farther away. But the sun, being as big as it is, does pull the waters some. And that brings us to spring tide and neap tide. This is best seen, of course, with spring and neap tide, when the sun and the earth and moon are lined up together. Sun, earth, moon. Sun, moon, earth, when they're all lined up together, and that's going to happen 2 times per month, high tide is higher and low tide is lower, because you do have a little bit more gravitational pull coming from the sun also. So you do get the water just a little bit farther out, and that extends it a little bit farther out here. High tide is higher and low tide is going to be lower whenever you have this spring tide. And that's the same case right here. You have that extra gravitational pull by the moon, which kind of stretches this out just a little bit and stretches that in just a little bit. That's when it's spring tide. Now, when the sun, the earth, and the moon are in an L shape, that's when it's called a neap tide. Now, what that will do, the high tide isn't as high and the low tide isn't as low. You still have high tide and low tide, but it's not going to be the extreme high tide you'd have at spring tide or the extreme low tide you'd have in spring tide. You know, something that a pretty clever thing is tides can also be used in electricity, used to make it. There are special bridges at bays and inlets that have gates and turbines and generators. And you can see from this example here, as the water flows, because water's going to flow from the high tide, low tide, and the moving of the water, then you use that to turn the turbine, which makes electricity from the generator. You know, we've kind of been through how that goes. So that's a pretty clever thing to be able to do that. The ocean overall is an incredible, vast area. And there may be up to 95% of the ocean overall that has been unexplored by mankind. Many, many, many different species of animals. Besides fish, there are bottom dwellers and floaters and swimmers, and even single-celled animals called protists. Now, many animals live in that tidal range, or that tidal zone, that space between high tide and low tide, which is somewhere here. Yeah, many different animals actually live right in this vicinity here. Now, you wouldn't think that, but think of how much this would encompass. There's really a lot of area that would encompass, and you get the whole range of the shoreland. There are mussels, crabs, starfish, seagulls, some of the animals that you would expect to see most often at the beach. Now, there is such a thing called an estuary, and I don't have it written very well there, but there it is. Estuary starts with an E. An estuary is where fresh water meets salt water. Where fresh water meets the salt water. And that's going to happen every time you have a river coming to the sea. That's going to happen, well, that's primarily where you'd happen, where you'd have river running into the sea. And the salinity of areas where river runs into the sea is kind of in between fresh water and salt water. Sometimes you have fresh water at the surface and the salt water's down below. You have many bays and inlets and harbors that are estuaries, where you have the fresh water and the salt water that mixed. And many plants and animals live here. Now, these areas are often called wetlands. Now, it's not etlands, but it's wetlands. As you can imagine, there is a W that starts there. But these are often called wetlands. Now, away from the equator, the wetlands you have are salt marshes. And here in the United States, when you get away from Florida, away from Texas, and come up the eastern coast, these wetlands are salt marshes. Now, this is an area right near the sea, but you have a lot of fresh water that's in it as well. The salinity, not as much salt in here, but it's an in-between area between high tide and low tide, between fresh water and salt water. This is a wetland, and lots of animals live here. Now, once you get down closer to the equator, you have what's called mangrove forest. And here are some examples of mangrove forest. Same thing, in between saltwater, freshwater, in between low tide and high tide. You can see here with this area here, which is kind of below the tide here. This must be a little bit lower tide. Kind of the same thing here. You have an area where the tide would come up, and you have this area of lower part. But you can imagine that both these places would have lots of animals. I mean, lots of animals can hide and protect themselves in these marshes, and lots of animals can hide and protect themselves way back in these mangrove forests. And it gives them protection, and it probably has food sources all around, and that's why you have a lot of animals that live there. You often find these two wetlands on the coast when there's not a beach. Now, many United States wetlands have been destroyed over the last 200 years. About half of the United States wetlands have been destroyed over the last 200 years, and all for the sake of building businesses and vacation-related spots. And you can see in this picture here, you have this estuary area, which has kind of a mangrove forest looking area, and you have construction going on here. And you can imagine a lot of people want to build condominiums, a lot of people want to build high-rise hotels right on the beach and right on the shoreline. And you can imagine that is probably why so many of these places have been destroyed, and all the animals with it kind of have to do something. It leaves them wide open, and they have to be unprotected or end up going elsewhere. Wetlands protect the land from the waves also. You get waves coming in here, and it kind of absorbs the blow with all this forest here. But if you tear down the forest, then that gives you a little more wave destruction. Also takes some of the heat of heavy storms. What did I do that for? Takes some of the heat of heavy storms, which will end up having an impact, less of an impact. And now I finally got it. Less of an impact whenever it hits these than whenever they hit buildings and cars. And it's not only that many animals that live near the coastline. About 1/2 of the world's population lives within 50 miles of the coast.